The village of Thornmere had always been suspicious of magic, but their hatred for Seraphina Blackthorn burned hotter than the witch trials of old. She stood at her cottage window, watching through cracked glass as another mob gathered in the town square below, their torches casting dancing shadows against the twilight sky. 23 years old and already bearing the weight of 1,000 accusations, she had learned to read the signs of impending violence like others read the weather. Tonight felt different, though more dangerous. The crowd was larger than usual, their voices carrying a venom that made her skin crawl with dread. She could see the mayor's son, Marcus, standing at the front with his chest puffed out in false bravery, no doubt telling tales of how she had cursed his father's crops to wither and die. It didn't matter that the drought had affected every farm 4 miles around, or that her own small garden had suffered the same fate. When misfortune struck Thornmere, they needed someone to blame. And the witch who lived alone on the hill made the perfect target. Seraphine's fingers traced the worn leather cover of her grandmother's grip, the only thing she had left from her family besides the cottage that had sheltered 3 generations of Blackthorn women. Each of them had faced the same hatred, the same fear, the same isolation that now consumed her days and haunted her nights. Her grandmother had warned her this day would come, when the villagers' fear would finally outweigh their need for her healing potions and protective charms. "They'll come for you eventually, little star," her grandmother had whispered on her deathbed, using the pet name that no one else would ever speak with such love. "When they do, remember that your magic comes from the earth itself, from the ancient powers that existed long before their small minds learned to fear what they couldn't understand. You are not the monster they believe you to be." But as Seraphina watched Marcus raise a crude wooden stake above his head, she wondered if her grandmother had been wrong. Perhaps she was a monster. Perhaps the darkness that lived inside her, the power that responded to her emotions with frightening intensity, was exactly what they claimed it to be. After all, hadn't she felt a savage satisfaction when Marcus's prize bull had broken its leg after he'd thrown stones at her cottage? Hadn't she smiled when the baker's wife developed a mysterious rash after refusing to sell her bread? The mob began to move up the hill, their torches bobbing like angry fireflies in the growing darkness. Seraphina could hear their chants now. Ugly words that cut deeper than any blade. Witch, demon, devils, whore. They screamed accusations that had followed her family for generations, stories that grew more twisted with each telling until truth became indistinguishable from nightmare. She closed her eyes and tried to center herself the way her grandmother had taught her, drawing power from the earth beneath her feet and the ancient oak tree that grew beside her cottage. The tree had been there for centuries, its roots deep and strong, its branches offering shelter to countless creatures over the years. It had watched over her family through good times and bad, and she drew comfort from its silent presence. But comfort wouldn't stop what was coming. The villagers had made their decision, and nothing she could say or do would change their minds. They wanted her gone, dead if possible, and they had finally worked up enough courage to act on their hatred. The fact that she had never actually harmed any of them didn't matter. The fact that she had healed their children's fevers and protected their homes from the wild magic that sometimes swept down from the mountains meant nothing now. The front door exploded inward with a crash that shook the entire cottage. Marcus burst through first, his face twisted with righteous fury and something that looked disturbingly like pleasure. Behind him came a dozen other men, all carrying weapons or ropes or tools that could serve as instruments of violence. They spread out quickly, surrounding her before she could even think of escape. Serafina Blackthorn, Marcus declared, his voice cracking slightly with nervous energy. By order of the village council, you are under arrest for the practice of dark magic, consorting with demons, and bringing curses upon the good people of Thornmere. She almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Village council? When had Thornmere ever had a proper village council? This was nothing more than a mob looking for legal justification for murder, and everyone in the room knew it. But she kept her expression carefully neutral, knowing that any sign of defiance would only fuel their rage. What proof do you have of these accusations? She asked quietly, her voice steady despite the fear that clawed at her throat. What evidence can you present that I have done any of the things you claim? Proof! Marcus laughed, and the sound was ugly and harsh. We don't need proof? Which everyone knows what you are. Everyone knows the evil that flows through your veins like poison. Your very existence is proof enough. One of the other men, a farmer named Willem, whose child she had once saved from a deadly fever, stepped forward with a length of rope in his hands. She saw shame in his eyes, but not enough to stop him from participating in what was about to happen. Fear was a powerful motivator, and these people were terrified of her, terrified of what they didn't understand. Please, she said, hating the way her voice broke on the word. I've never hurt any of you. I've helped your families, healed your sick, protected your homes. Why are you doing this? Because you're an abomination, Marcus spat, grabbing her arm with enough force to leave bruises. Because your kind brings nothing but death and destruction wherever you go. Because the world will be a better place without you in it. As they bound her hands behind her back with rough rope that bit into her skin, Serafina felt something dark and dangerous stirring in the depths of her soul. It was the same power that had frightened her grandmother, the same magic that she had spent years learning to control and suppress. But now, faced with the very real possibility of death at the hands of people she had tried to help, that control began to slip. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees in as many seconds. Frost began to form on the windows, and the flames of their torches flickered and dimmed as if an invisible wind was trying to extinguish them. The men noticed the change immediately, their eyes widening with a mixture of terror and vindication. You see, Marcus shouted, though his voice now carried a note of fear. She's calling on her dark powers even now. We have to stop her before she curses us all. But Serafina wasn't calling on anything. The magic was responding to her emotions. Without conscious direction, rising up like a tide of darkness that threatened to sweep away everything in its path. She could feel it building inside her, raw and wild and hungry for release. All she had to do was let go, just for a moment, and these men would learn exactly why their ancestors had feared the Blackthorn witches. Instead, she closed her eyes and forced the power back down, wrapping it in mental chains forged from years of discipline and self. She would not give them the satisfaction of proving their accusations true. She would not become the monster they wanted her to be. No matter what they did to her, the frost disappeared as quickly as it had come, and the torches flared back to their normal brightness. The men relaxed slightly, though their grip on their weapons remained firm. They had seen enough to know that their fears weren't entirely unfounded, but they had also seen her choose restraint over violence. Not that it would save her. If anything, the display of power had only convinced them that they were doing the right thing. They dragged her from the cottage that had been her sanctuary, past the garden where she had grown herbs for healing potions, past the oak tree that had watched over her family for generations. The mob was waiting outside, their faces twisted with hatred and bloodlust. Someone had already built a pyre in the clearing, the wood stacked high and dry, ready for the flames that would end her life. As they forced her toward what would surely be her death, Seraphina found herself thinking not of spells or magic or escape, but of her grandmother's words about the ancient powers that had existed long before small minds learned to fear. She thought of the earth beneath her feet, the sky above her head, and the magic that flowed through all living things like blood through veins. If this was to be her end, she would face it with dignity. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her beg or break. She was Seraphina Blackthorn, the last of her line, and she would die as her grandmother had lived, with her head held high and her magic burning bright in her soul. Subscribe to our channel to discover what happens next in this incredible tale of magic and redemption. Will Seraphina escape her fate? Or is this truly the end for the last Blackthorn witch? Don't miss the next thrilling chapter where destiny arrives in the most unexpected form. Hit that subscribe button now for more epic fantasy stories. The pyre stood before Seraphina like a wooden mountain, its carefully arranged logs forming a perfect circle of death around the tall stake that would serve as her final resting place. The villagers had spared no effort in building her funeral monument, their hatred translating into meticulous craftsmanship that would ensure the flames burned hot and fast. Marcus forced her to her knees beside the structure, his hands rough and unforgiving as he prepared to bind her to the stake. "Any last words?" which he asked, his voice carrying a mockery that made several villagers laugh nervously. "Any curses you'd like to hurl at us before you meet your master below?" Seraphina lifted her head and met his gaze with steady eyes that held no fear, only a profound sadness for the ignorance that had brought them all to this moment. "I forgive you," she said quietly, and the words fell into the evening air like stones into still water. "All of you, I forgive you for your fear, for your hatred, and for what you're about to do. May you find peace with your choices when the truth finally comes to light." The unexpected response clearly rattled Marcus, who had been hoping for dramatic threats or desperate pleas that would justify what they were doing. Instead, her calm acceptance and offer of forgiveness made him feel small and cruel emotions he wasn't equipped to handle. He backhanded her across the face with enough force to split her lip, drawing a gasp of outrage from some of the watching villagers who still possessed vestiges of human decency. "Shut your mouth," he snarled, though his voice shook with something that might have been guilt. "We don't want your devil's mercy." As they hauled her to her feet and began tying her to the stake, Seraphina felt the ancient magic in her blood responding to the injustice of the moment. The ropes seemed to burn against her skin, not from any supernatural heat, but from the sheer wrongness of binding someone whose only crime was being different. She could feel the power building again, stronger this time, fed by righteous anger and the primal instinct for survival. The oak tree beside her cottage began to sway despite the complete absence of wind, its ancient branches creaking with sounds that resembled whispered warnings. The villagers noticed but attributed it to their own nervousness rather than any supernatural influence. They were too focused on their grim task to pay attention to the subtle signs that the very forest around them was growing agitated. Willem stepped forward with a burning torch, his hands shaking so badly that drops of flaming pitch fell to the ground at his feet. His eyes met Seraphine's for just a moment, and she saw the conflict raging within him. This was a man who owed her his daughter's life, yet fear of being labeled a witch sympathizer kept him moving forward with the crowd. "I'm sorry," he whispered, so quietly that only she could hear. "God forgive me, but I'm so sorry." "I know," she replied, her voice gentle despite everything. "Take care of little Anna. Make sure she remembers that magic isn't always dark, that sometimes it's just another way of helping people." Willem's face crumpled with shame, but before he could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the valley like rolling thunder. The crowd turned as one toward the forest road, their expressions shifting from bloodthirsty determination to confusion and growing alarm. No one traveled these paths after dark. Not with the wild magic that sometimes swept down from the mountains and the creatures that hunted in the shadows between worlds. The rider who emerged from the tree line was like something out of legend, a figure so imposing that several villagers actually took steps backward despite the safety of their numbers. His horse was a massive black stallion that moved with supernatural grace, its hooves striking sparks from the stone-strewn path as it carried its master toward the gathering with deliberate, measured steps. But it was the rider himself who commanded absolute attention. Even in the flickering torchlight, his presence was unmistakable. Tall and broad-shouldered, he sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to command. Dark hair fell to his shoulders beneath a circlet of silver that marked him as royalty, while armor that gleamed like starlight covered his powerful frame. When his eyes swept over the crowd, Seraphina felt her breath catch in her throat. Those eyes were the color of storm clouds shot through with lightning, gray and silver, and filled with an intelligence that seemed to pierce straight through to the soul. But it was the power radiating from him that truly took her breath away. This wasn't just a warrior or even a king. This was something far more dangerous and magnificent than anything she had ever encountered. "What?" he said, his voice carrying easily across the clearing despite its deceptively quiet tone. "Is the meaning of this gathering?" Marcus, who had been so brave when facing a bound and helpless woman, suddenly found himself struggling to form coherent words. Your Majesty," he stammered, offering a clumsy bow that nearly sent him tumbling into the pyre. "We didn't expect, that is, we weren't told you were traveling through our lands." "I goer, I will," the king replied, dismounting with fluid grace that spoke of years in the saddle and countless battles fought and won. As his boots touched the ground, Seraphina felt the earth itself seem to acknowledge his presence, as if the very soil recognized the authority he carried. "Now answer my question. What is happening here?" The crowd parted before him like water before the prow of a ship, their earlier courage evaporating in the face of true power. Marcus tried to muster his authority, puffing out his chest and pointing at Seraphina with a trembling finger. "We're executing a witch, Your Majesty," he declared, though his voice cracked on the words. "This woman has been practicing dark magic, cursing our crops and bringing evil into our lands. We're only doing what must be done to protect ourselves." The king's gaze shifted to Seraphina, and she felt the weight of his attention like a physical force. For a long moment, he simply studied her, taking in her bound form, her split lip, and the defiant way she held her head despite her circumstances. When their eyes met, something passed between them, a spark of recognition that had nothing to do with prior meetings and everything to do with souls recognizing their match in another. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice gentler now, but no less commanding. "Seraphina Blackthorn, Your Majesty," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "Last of my line, and apparently last of my days. If these good people have their way." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Blackthorn," he repeated thoughtfully. "I knew your grandmother, Lady Morgana. She was a woman of great wisdom and greater power. She once saved my father's life when all the court physicians had given up hope." The revelation sent shockwaves through the crowd. Marcus's face went pale as he realized the implications of what the king had just revealed. If the royal family held the Blackthorn witches in high regard, if they had actually benefited from their magic, then everything they believed about Seraphina might be wrong. "That's impossible," Marcus protested weakly. "The Blackthorns are servants of darkness. Everyone knows that the stories... The stories..." The king interrupted, his voice taking on a dangerous edge that made the air around him seem to crackle with barely contained power. "Are told by small-minded fools who fear what they cannot understand. Lady Morgana Blackthorn was one of the most powerful healers in the known world, and her magic came from the earth itself, not from any dark source." He moved toward the pyre with measured steps, each footfall seeming to thunder despite the soft ground beneath his feet. The villagers scrambled to get out of his way, suddenly realizing that they might have made a terrible mistake. When he reached Seraphina, he extended his hand toward the ropes that bound her. "Allow me," he said, and at his touch, the ropes simply fell away as if they had never been tied at all. Magic, Seraphina realized, but not the kind that came from spells or rituals. This was something far older and more primal, the kind of power that was born rather than learned. For that was his name, though Seraphina didn't know yet, smiled grimly. "The only thing they prove is that nature sometimes brings hardship, and frightened people always look for someone to blame." "Thank you," she whispered, rubbing feeling back into her wrists where the ropes had cut off circulation. "Though I'm not sure your intervention will change anything. They've made up their minds about what I am." "Have they?" he asked, turning to face the crowd that now watched with growing horror as they realized the magnitude of their error. "Tell me, good people of Thornmere, how many of you have been healed by this woman's magic? How many of your children owe their lives to her skill with herbs and healing?" Several hands rose reluctantly, then more, until nearly half the crowd was admitting to having benefited from Seraphine's help at one time or another. The king nodded grimly, his expression growing darker with each admission. "And yet you would burn her alive," he said, his voice carrying a weight of judgment that made grown men tremble. "You would destroy someone who has dedicated her life to helping others, simply because you fear what you don't understand." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, many of them unable to meet his gaze. Marcus, however, wasn't ready to admit defeat. "But the curses, Your Majesty," he insisted desperately, "the failed crops, the sick animals, the misfortunes that have plagued our village, surely those prove her guilt." King Theron, for that was his name, though Seraphina didn't know it yet, smiled grimly. "The only thing they prove is that nature sometimes brings hardship and frightened people always look for someone to blame. King Theron's presence seemed to fill the entire clearing, his authority radiating outward like ripples on a still pond. The villagers who had been so eager for blood just moments before now stood in uncomfortable silence, their torches flickering weakly in hands that trembled with growing realization of their mistake. But Seraphina barely noticed their discomfort. She was too busy trying to understand the man who had quite literally saved her life. There was something about him that called to the magic in her blood, a resonance that made her power hum like a tuning fork struck against crystal. When he had touched the ropes binding her, she had felt a jolt of recognition so profound it left her breathless. This wasn't just any king who had happened upon their grim gathering. This was someone whose very existence seemed intertwined with her own in ways she couldn't begin to fathom. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, still finding it hard to believe she was addressing royalty while standing beside what had been intended as her funeral pyre. "You mentioned knowing my grandmother. Might I ask how you came to be acquainted with her?" A shadow passed across his features, something that looked like old pain mixed with deep respect. 25 years ago, when I was barely more than a boy, my father fell victim to a curse placed by enemies of the crown. Every healer in the kingdom tried to save him, but the dark magic was too strong, too deeply rooted in his very essence. We were told to prepare for his death. The king's voice grew distant as he relived the memory, his storm-gray eyes focused on something beyond the present moment. My mother was desperate. She had heard whispers of a witch who lived in the borderlands, someone with power enough to challenge even the darkest curses. Against the advice of every counselor and priest in the kingdom, she rode out to find Morgana Black. Seraphina felt her breath catch. Her grandmother had never spoken of healing royalty, though she had always been secretive about some of her more significant works. The old woman had believed that true power came with the responsibility to help those in need, regardless of their station or ability to pay. "Grandmother saved your father?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from the way his expression softened with gratitude. "More than saved him," Theron replied, turning to face her fully. "She didn't just break the curse, she taught him how to protect himself and his bloodline from future magical attacks. The wards she placed around our family line are still active today, passed down through blood and bone to each new generation." The implications of his words hit her like a physical blow. If the royal family carried protective magic tied to Blackthorn, power, if her grandmother's magic flowed through their very blood, then the connection she felt to this man ran deeper than attraction or gratitude. It was literally written into their magical DNA. Marcus, who had been growing increasingly pale as the king spoke, finally found his voice again. "But your Majesty, surely you can see that this woman is dangerous. The power she wields, the strange things that happen around her. Even if her grandmother helped your family, that doesn't mean she can be trusted." King Theron's attention shifted to the village leader, and the temperature in the clearing seemed to drop several degrees. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet menace that had silenced armies and toppled kingdoms. "Dangerous." He repeated the word rolling off his tongue like a curse. "You speak of danger while standing beside a pyre you built to burn an innocent woman alive. You talk of trust while preparing to murder someone who has spent her life healing your sick and protecting your homes. Tell me, Marcus Brennan, which of us poses the greater threat to innocent life? The fact That the king knew Marcus's full name sent another wave of fear through the crowd. This wasn't some chance encounter or coincidental rescue. King Theron had come here with purpose, with knowledge of their plans and their people. The realization that they might have been watched, judged, and found wanting made several villagers exchange nervous glances. "I think," the king continued, his voice cutting through the night air like a blade, "that it's time for you all to return to your homes and reflect on what you were about to do. Consider yourselves fortunate that I arrived when I did, because the penalty for attempting to harm someone under royal protection is considerably more severe than whatever imaginary crimes you've attributed to Lady Seraphina. Royal protection." The words hit the crowd like a thunderbolt, and Seraphina herself felt her knees go weak. She wasn't just some village witch anymore. She was under the personal protection of the most powerful man in the kingdom. It changed everything, shifted the entire balance of power in ways that would ripple through the region for years to come. The villagers began to disperse, their earlier bloodlust replaced by shame and fear of royal retribution. Marcus lingered longer than the others, his face twisted with frustrated rage at seeing his prey snatched away at the last moment. But even he wasn't foolish enough to challenge a king directly, especially one whose power was becoming more apparent with each passing moment. As the clearing emptied, leaving only Seraphina and King Theron beside the cold pyre, an silence settled between them. She found herself acutely aware of how she must look, her dress torn and dirty, her hair tangled from the rough handling, her lips still bleeding from Marcus's blow. Not exactly the image one wanted to present when meeting royalty for the first time. "You're hurt," the king observed, stepping closer to examine her injuries with eyes that missed nothing. "Let me see." Before she could protest, he reached out and gently tilted her face toward the moonlight, his fingers warm against her skin as he examined the cut on her lip. The touch sent electricity racing through her entire body, a magical resonance so intense she gasped and stepped back instinctively. He felt it too. She could see it in the way his eyes widened and his hand lingered in the air where her face had been. "Extraordinary," he breathed, staring at his own fingers as if they had betrayed him. "I felt your power respond to mine." "How is that possible?" "I don't know," she admitted, her own voice shaky with the aftershocks of whatever had just passed. "Between them, I've never experienced anything like that before. It was like our magic recognized each other, because it does," he said with growing certainty. "The protection wards your grandmother placed on my family line, they're not just external shields. They're integrated into our very essence, woven through our blood and bones. And if you're her direct descendant, if you carry the same magical signature, then we're already connected," she finished, understanding flooding through her like dawn breaking over a dark landscape. "The magic recognizes its own source." King Theron nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of wonder and something that looked almost like fear. "This changes things," he said quietly. "You can't stay here. Not after tonight. Even with royal protection, there will always be those who see you as a threat, who will work to turn others against you." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. Thornmere had been her home for 23 years, the only life she had ever known. The cottage held every memory of her grandmother, every lesson learned, every moment of peace she had managed to find in a world that feared her very existence. The thought of leaving it all behind made her heart ache with a grief so profound she could barely breathe. King Theron moved closer, his presence overwhelming in the best possible way. When he spoke, his voice carried absolute conviction, I've spent my entire life learning to judge the character of those around me. I've seen true evil, faced genuine darkness, and fought against those who would use power for selfish ends. You, Lady Seraphina, are nothing like them. He gestured toward the abandoned pyre, toward the village that had condemned her without evidence or trial. Anyone else with your level of power would have defended themselves tonight. You could have struck down every person in that mob without breaking stride, could have turned their own hatred against them in ways that would have left them begging for the mercy of Esking, for that was his name though Seraphina didn't know it yet, smiled grimly. The only thing they prove is that nature sometimes brings hardship and frightened people always look for someone to blame. Where would I go? She asked, hating how small and lost her voice sounded. This is all I've ever known. My grandmother is buried in the garden behind the cottage. Her spirit still walks the old oak tree. How can I just leave all of that behind? The king's expression softened with understanding and something that might have been sympathy. I'm not suggesting you abandon your heritage, he said gently. I'm offering you the chance to honor it in a place where your gifts will be valued rather than feared. Come with me to the royal court. Serve as my family's healer and magical advisor, as your grandmother did before you. The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning two completely different worlds. On one side lay everything she had ever known, familiar but hostile, safe but limiting. On the other side lay the unknown, a future filled with possibilities she had never dared to imagine, but also with dangers she couldn't begin to predict. You barely know me, she pointed out, though her heart was already reaching toward the possibility he offered. How can you be sure I'm worthy of such trust? What if the villagers are right? What if there is darkness in me that even I don't recognize? King Theron moved closer, his presence overwhelming in the best possible way. When he spoke, his voice carried absolute conviction. I've spent my entire life learning to judge the character of those around me. I've seen true evil faced genuine darkness and fought against those who would use power for selfish ends. You, Lady Seraphina, are nothing like them. He gestured toward the abandoned pyre, toward the village that had condemned her without evidence or trial. Anyone else with your level of power would have defended themselves tonight. You could have struck down every person in that mob without breaking stride, could have turned their own hatred against them in ways that would have left them begging for the mercy of simple death. Instead, you chose restraint. You chose forgiveness. That tells me everything I need to know about who you truly are. Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back began to stream down her cheeks. For the first time in her life, someone saw her power not as a curse to be feared, but as a gift to be treasured. Someone looked at her magic and saw potential for good rather than inevitability of evil. When would we leave? She asked, and the question felt like stepping off a cliff into open air. Tomorrow, he replied without hesitation. Give you time to gather what you need from your cottage, to say goodbye to your grandmother's memory properly. But after that, your old life ends and your new one begins. As if summoned by his words, a wind began to blow through the clearing, carrying with it the scent of wild flowers and ancient magic. The old oak tree beside her cottage swayed gently, its branches moving in a rhythm that seemed almost like a benediction. Even the earth beneath her feet felt different, charged with possibility and the promise of change. Tomorrow, everything would be different. Tomorrow, she would leave behind the only home she had ever known and step into a future that both terrified and exhilarated her. But tonight, for just a few more hours, she was still Seraphina Blackthorn of Thornmere, the last witch in a village that had never understood her worth. Don't miss what happens. Next in this incredible tale of magic and royal intrigue, will Seraphina find her place in the royal court? Or will new enemies emerge to threaten the growing bond between the witch and the warrior king? Subscribe to our channel for the breathtaking conclusion where ancient prophecies collide with modern hearts. Hit that subscribe button now. The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. Thornmere had been her home for 23 years, the only life she had ever known. The cottage held every memory of her grandmother, every lesson learned, every moment of peace she had managed to find in a world that feared her very existence. The thought of leaving it all behind made her heart ache with a grief so profound she could barely breathe. King Theron moved closer, his presence overwhelming in the best possible way. When he spoke, his voice carried absolute conviction. I've spent my entire life learning to judge the character of those around me. I've seen true evil, faced genuine darkness, and fought against those who would use power for selfish ends. You, Lady Seraphina, are nothing like them. He gestured toward the abandoned pyre, toward the village that had condemned her without evidence or trial. Anyone else with your level of power would have defended themselves tonight. You could have struck down every person in that mob without breaking stride. Could have turned their own hatred against them in ways that would have left them begging for the mercy of a King Theron. For that was his name, though Seraphina didn't know it yet. Smiled grimly. The only thing they prove is that nature sometimes brings hardship, and frightened people always look for someone to blame. 3 months had passed since Seraphina left Thornmere behind, and the royal court had become more home to her than she ever thought possible. The ancient castle of Ravenshollow stood like a crown jewel against the mountain skyline, its soaring towers and graceful bridges, a testament to centuries of magical and architectural evolution. Here, her power wasn't just accepted but celebrated, her knowledge sought after by nobles and commoners alike who came seeking her healing touch. But it was the man who had saved her that truly made this place feel like home. King Theron had been everything he promised and more, treating her not as a rescued curiosity but as an equal partner in protecting the realm. Their magical connection had only grown stronger over the months, creating a bond that went far beyond mere attraction or political alliance. This morning found her in the castle's highest tower, working in the magical laboratory that had been specially constructed for her use. Crystalline walls amplified her power, while protective wards kept any magical experiments from affecting the rest of the castle. She was preparing a particularly complex healing potion when she felt his presence approaching, that familiar tingle along her magical senses that always announced his arrival. "Good morning, my lady," Theron said as he entered the chamber, though his formal tone was belied by the warmth in his storm-gray eyes. "I trust your work goes well." "Better than well," she replied, gesturing to the shimmering potion that swirled with its own inner light. "This should be able to cure the wasting sickness that's been affecting the northern province. One dose will not only heal the afflicted but provide immunity against future outbreaks." The pride in his expression made her heart flutter in a way that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with the deep affection that had grown between them. Over the past months, they had worked together to solve problems that would have been impossible for either of them to handle alone. Her magical knowledge, combined with his political acumen, had already prevented 3 potential wars and saved countless lives. "Remarkable, as always," he said, moving closer to examine her work. "Though, I have to admit, I didn't come here just to check on your progress. There's something I need to discuss with you." The serious tone in his voice made her look up from her work with growing concern. "What's wrong? Has something happened?" "Nothing's wrong," he assured her quickly, then paused as if gathering his courage for something significant. "Actually, something wonderful has happened, but it brings with it certain complications." Before she could ask what he meant, he dropped to one knee beside her workbench, pulling a ring from his pocket that made her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't the massive, ostentatious jewelry she might have expected from royalty. Instead, it was elegant in its simplicity, a silver band set with a stone that seemed to capture starlight itself. "Seraphina Blackthorn," he said, his voice filled with emotion that made her magic respond with a warm glow that lit the entire chamber. "These past months have shown me something I never thought possible. You've proven that people from completely different worlds can find perfect harmony when their souls are meant to be together." Tears began streaming down her face as she realized what was happening. This powerful king, this warrior who commanded armies and ruled vast territories, was proposing to her. The infamous witch that no one had wanted had somehow found her way to the heart of the most extraordinary man she had ever met. "I love you," he continued, his words echoing through the crystal chamber like a sacred vow. "I love your strength, your compassion, your brilliant mind, and the way your magic sings in harmony with mine. I love how you've brought light to the darkest corners of this kingdom and hope to hearts that had given up on miracles." She wanted to say yes immediately, to throw herself into his arms and accept the future he was offering without hesitation. But something in his expression told her there was more to this proposal than romantic impulse. "The complications you mentioned," she said softly, though her heart was pounding so hard she could barely think. "What exactly are we facing?" His expression grew serious, though he remained on one knee before her. "The nobles have been whispering," he admitted. "Not all of them approve of the influence you've gained at court. Some of them see our connection as dangerous, a king bewitched by a sorceress rather than a partnership between equals." The words stung, but they didn't surprise her. She had noticed the way certain courtiers watched her, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. Old prejudices died hard, especially among those who had built their power on the fears and superstitions of others. "There's also the matter of the prophecy," Theron continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The courtiers have been studying the ancient texts since you arrived, trying to understand the magical bond between us. What they found was unexpected." "What kind of prophecy?" she asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. "When shadow and light unite as one, when witch and warrior share the throne, the ancient powers shall wake once more, and magic shall flow as it did of old." He recited from memory. "It speaks of a joining that will restore the magical balance to the realm, but also warns of great trials that must be faced before that restoration can be complete." Seraphina felt her magical senses tingling with recognition. The words resonated with something deep in her bloodline memory, as if her grandmother had whispered similar prophecies in her dreams. You think we're the ones the prophecy speaks of? I'm certain of it, he replied without hesitation. The magical resonance between us, the way our powers amplify each other. The timing of your arrival just as the kingdom faces new magical threats from the eastern borders. Everything points to this being our destiny. She looked down at the ring he still held, its captured starlight seeming to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. And you're willing to face whatever trials come, knowing that marrying me might bring danger to your kingdom. I'm willing to face anything, he said with fierce conviction, as long as I face it with you at my side. The question is whether you're willing to accept not just my love, but the crown that comes with it. Being queen won't be easy, especially for someone with your unique gifts. There will always be those who see you as a threat rather than an asset. The magnitude of what he was offering hit her like a tidal wave. Not just marriage, but a crown. Not just love, but the responsibility for an entire kingdom's well-being. It was overwhelming and terrifying and absolutely perfect all at once. I've spent my entire life being feared and misunderstood, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I've been called monster, demon, devil's servant, and worse. But you see me as I truly am, and you've given me a place where my gifts can heal rather than harm. She reached out and took the ring from his trembling hand, feeling the magic woven into the metal respond to her touch. Yes, she said, sliding it onto her finger where it fit as if it had been made specifically for her. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll face whatever prophecies and trials await us. And yes, I'll be your queen, no matter what the nobles or anyone else thinks about it. I'm certain of it, he replied without hesitation. The magical resonance between us, the way our powers amplify each other, the timing of your arrival just as the kingdom faces new magical threats from the eastern borders. Everything points to this being our destiny. The joy that blazed in his eyes was so intense it made her magic flare in response, filling the crystal chamber with a light so bright it could probably be seen from the valley below. He surged to his feet and caught her in his arms, spinning her around. His laughter bubbled up from both of them. When he finally set her down, his hands came up to frame her face with infinite tenderness. I love you, future Queen Seraphina, he whispered against her lips. And I love you, my warrior king, she replied, just before he kissed her with all the passion and promise of their shared future. Outside the crystal chamber, the first snow of winter began to fall, but neither of them noticed. They were too busy planning a wedding that would unite not just their hearts but their magical destinies, creating a bond that would reshape the kingdom and fulfill prophecies that had waited centuries for the right souls to claim them. The infamous witch that no one had wanted had found her place at last, not just in a king's heart, but on a throne where her power would protect and heal an entire realm. And the warrior king who had saved her had discovered that sometimes the greatest victories came not from conquest, but from opening one's heart to the magic of unexpected love. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey from persecution to palace, from fear to true love. If this epic tale of magic and destiny moved your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more amazing fantasy stories that prove love can conquer even the darkest prejudices. Share this story with someone who believes in the power of seeing beyond surface fears to the magic that lies within. Hit that subscribe button and that notification bell to never miss our latest enchanting adventures. She reached out and took the ring from his trembling hand, feeling the magic woven into the metal respond to her touch. "Yes," she said, sliding it onto her finger where it fit, as if it had been made specifically for her. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll face whatever prophecies and trials await us. And yes, I'll be your queen, no matter what the nobles or anyone else thinks about it." "I'm certain of it," he replied without hesitation. "The magical resonance between us, the way our powers amplify each other, the timing of your arrival just as the kingdom faces new magical threats from the eastern borders. Everything points to this being our destiny."